But today you're just going to kind of hear a little bit from me. And I hope as we begin that this is a time of sacred pause for us to take a moment to breathe in and to be present of the space and the land upon which we are sitting. The rich soil of our storied land. So, who made life on the land this community of faith stewards? Who were they before we were here? And for whom was the land sanctuary? Well, we know one tribe of people, and they were the Caulipuyan Tribes. And they have been here since time immemorial. The Kalapuyans originally occupied over 1 million acres in the Willamette and Umpqua valleys. And the Caulipuyan tribes were about 19 tribes and bands in 3 distinct areas. And they were organized linguistically north, central, and south. And the genetic evidence shows that the earliest people lived in Oregon, in this place we call Oregon, around 16,000 BC. And between 15 to 13,000 BC, the Willamette Valley was shaped by a series of up to 80 huge floods. And the Missoula floods coursed down the Columbia and Umatilla rivers, and the Kalapuya have stories of the flood escape. And so I'm going to turn the screen over to Allie, and we're going to hear one of those stories.
My name is David Harrelson. I'm the Cultural Resources Manager for the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, and I'm Kalapuya, the original people of the Willamette Valley. My ancestors have been here since time immemorial, since a time that no one can remember, and our people remember a very long time. The oldest thing that our ancestors remember and that we've passed down generation to generation is the flooding of the Willamette Valley. And geologists estimate that that happened between 13 and 18,000 years ago. That's over 500 generations of our people living in this place, the Willamette Valley. Our ancestors have stories of when this valley flooded. Over 400 feet of water filled the valley, and it covered up, only creating a few islands in the valley. And one of those places that people sought refuge and saved themselves was this mountain behind me, Mary's Peak. And Mary's Peak is a sacred place to our people. It's a place where people go to seek empowerment and have for generations and generations, as well as peace. And it's a special place to us. In the last few years, the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde has been able to work with the Mary's Peak Alliance on the naming of creeks on Mary's Peak. It was a really exciting project to be able to work on. And what we were able to do is we were able to suggest names for creeks that flowed into the Willamette Valley, the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya people. We were able to suggest Kalapuya names. As a part of that, you'll notice some of those names like Osni, Ashayam, they all start with Ah. And Ah is the equivalent of the coyote or the bear. And we did that to be able to provide some sort of uniformity of recognition and understanding for naming. It's something that a lot of people don't realize in the Willamette Valley, but many of the Kalapuya place names still exist today. Names like Champui, which means the place to dig yampa root. Places like Chemeketa, which we have Chemeketa Community College. That was the name of the village at Salem. Chemawa, which is an inundated place of water. All of these names, Cha means the place of something, and then another name. So we used Ah, and then the names, Sni for coyote, Ashayam for bear, as well as Anquaqua for frog. And these were all very special names, and we're very excited to see them as a part of the landscape of Mary's Peak today.
So, as you hear that story of Mary's Peak, let's ask ourselves, what was the community's relationship with the land? We know that tribal territories were associated with the tributary watersheds of the region's two main streams, the Willamette and Umpqua rivers. And with each of those territories, there was a variety of habitats. People lived in the riverine habitat, in the prairie. They lived in the savanna and in the forest. And under the Kalapuya elite stewardship, the Willamette Valley was a carefully managed landscape designed and controlled by fire and harvesting. And this is what the Willamette Valley vegetation looked like in the 1850s. The Caulipuyan had shelter, and in the drier months, they camped outside in the open under minimal shelter. And then in the winter time, when there was reduced harvest, they lived in winter houses and sheltered village sites. And they were a stable society, and they harvested fruits and vegetables of the valley, and they hunted and fished the terrestrial and aquatic animals to provide their primary food sources. And they used what they found in nature, the plants, the stones, the rocks, for their tool, to make their tools. And they moved across the tribal territories in response to seasonal variations and the resources that were available. So in the summer, there was fishing, there were freshwater mussels and crawfish, there were sturgeon and salmon, there was bitterroot and berries. And then in the fall, the acorns and the quail and the grouse. In the winter, the deer and elk. And in the spring, the camas and the cattails. They ate according to what was growing in the season and to what they could store. And the grasslands that replaced the fire managed oak savannas produced abundant foods, such as the camas lily. The women harvested the camas by pressing hard digging sticks into the ground to pry up the earth containing the bulbs, and then they were placed in their gathering baskets. The white oak acorns, they were harvested and then leached, and then they were ground into meal. Hazelnuts were dried and stored in baskets. Tarweed, their seeds were parched and they were ground into meal and made into loaves. The wapato plant, it's a marshy plant, and the tubers were get taken out of the ground and then they were later baked. We note that they also ate deer and elk and beaver and many different kinds of terrestrial animals. Fishing for salmon and steelhead, trout. They lived off the abundance of the land. Interestingly enough, though, unbeknownst to them, in 1493, Pope Alexander VI issued a decree in which he authorized Spain and Portugal to colonize the Americas and its native peoples as subjects. And that's when things began to change. There was a period of contact with the European explorers. Explorers such as Francis Drake is thought to have maybe reached the southern Oregon coast. And then there was an historic period between 1750 and 1806 when there were more European settlers And there was the contact with the fur traders, the fur trappers. And Captain Robert Gray explored a great river and traded goods with local Indians living there. And he named it the Columbia River after his ship, the Columbia Reviva. Sorry about that. And then in 1787, Congress enacts the Northwest Ordinance. That ordinance prohibited slavery in the Northwest Territory, of which the state of Oregon is now part of, but it also said the utmost good faith shall always be observed toward the Indians. Their lands and property shall never be taken from them without their consent. And in 1806, Lewis and Clark, when they were here in Oregon, may have heard the name Kalapuya from a, a Clawalla man in reference to the people living in the Willamette Valley. But this Northwest Ordinance and this doctrine of discovery began to create intergenerational trauma. In the period between 1811 and 1829, enterprises of the British and Americans brought changes to tribal economies. How many were in school and heard of the Hudson's Bay Company? I remember hearing about that. And in the period between 1829 and 1850, more change happened. There was catastrophic epidemics of diseases such as malaria and smallpox that wiped out more than 90% of the Kalapuya people, who once numbered more than 40,000. As I read that figure, I thought about present day COVID and the impact that that is having on us. And all of a sudden, when I heard this catastrophic epidemics, it was no longer something I was reading in a history book. It was real. It was today. It is today. And the Kalapuyans experienced vast changes to the culture and invasions by colonizers from the United States, French Canadian settlement, and tribes like the Klickitat, who invaded the Kalapuyans' homeland and began taking their lands and resources. What happens when your numbers are drastically reduced? In 1845, the phrase manifest destiny was coined, and it was used to justify US settlers, and it meant to redeem, take the West. It was our manifest destiny to do so. And Great Britain relinquished its shared claim on the land because the US strategy of gaining land by occupying it is working. And in 1848, Congress establishes Oregon Territory with anti-slavery laws intact. And that Oregon Territory included parts of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. And in 1844, the Oregon Trail began, and settlers from the East began arriving in local tribal territories. And the Oregon Donation Land Claims Act is enacted, and Congress gives away Indian land without treaties or compensation, 1 square mile, 640 acres of free land for the earliest white or half-breed native settlers. And in 1850 to 54, that land donation was reduced to 1/2 acre. And it could happen because it was the manifest destiny of the United States to redeem this land. And so in the fourth period between 1851 and 1857, there were treaties, removals to reservations, and reservation life, all with significant changes to the tribes. The Office of the Superintendent of Indian Affairs for Oregon Territory and the Treaty Commission to remove the Native Americans to out-of-the-way reservations was created in 1851. And Kalapuyan bands signed treaties. And a typical treaty was that like the Tualatans signed, where they surrendered 1,500 square miles in exchange for farming equipment, no money, and the promise of 40 acres on a future reservation. The Tualatans resisted, but they were warned they had no real choice. The whites were determined to settle on your land, they were told. In my own story, I think about the promise of 40 acres and a mule. Hmm. In 1856, the Oregon Trail of Tears occurred. It was the winter of 1856, and the federal government began the forced removal of the Umpqua, Southern Kalapuya, Rogue River, and Shasta peoples to a reservation in Oregon's Coast Range. Cavalry rounded and marched 325 Indians 265 miles in February during harsh winter conditions. 33 days that journey took. 8 people died and 8 babies were born. And some bragged that the same number as started arrived to Grand Ronde. As I thought about that story, I just thought about this past week. This is February, and we had the worst ice storm that we've had in years. And that ice storm was brutal. And I thought about this 11-year-old boy in Texas who died of hypothermia. And I thought about those who were sheltering outside and how we asked them to go inside so that they could be warm. And then I think about the Kalapuyan peoples journeying in harsh February weather. Let's take a moment just to remember them. The Grand Ronde Reservation, that's where that was the reservation that was set up. And that reservation was established because of several treaties. And it was promised that there would be 60,000 acres of heavily forested land in the Coast Range. And so the Kalapuya, along with many other Indian tribes from all over Oregon and Northern California, had to move onto the reservation. And in Western Oregon, over 27 tribes were consolidated on 2 reservations. And this stands in contrast to previous decades where treaties with Eastern tribes involved individual tribes who were removed to individual reservations. Think about it. And then in the 1850s to the 1890s, the Indian life on the reservation was very difficult. And the forts were built on mountain passes near the Grand Ronde and the Siletz reservations, and they were manned by Army troops. And Indians were not allowed to leave the reservation except with a pass. And that immediately took me to my story of my ancestors who were enslaved on plantations, and they couldn't leave unless they had a pass. From 1859 to the present, in 1859, the state of Oregon was founded. And I was looking up the state song, and it starts, land of the empire builders, land of the golden west, conquered and held by freemen. Ooh. I hear that we're reconsidering our state song now. 1870, the Grand Ronde government had their first elected council. And in 1887, the Dawes Allotment Act made it possible for Indian reservations such as the Grand Ronde to be divided up. And soon, much of the land was owned by non-Indian settlers. And the full impact of that act on tribal resilience wasn't to be felt until well into the 20th century as the reservation lands continued to be sold to the public. And at a time of the establishment of the reservation, there were about 1,000 Indians residing in the reservation, and the population declined due to disease, malnutrition, and assimilation, so that in 1900, it was reduced to about 300 people. And in 1924, Indian Citizen Act declared that all Native Americans are naturalized citizens of the United States. And in 1936, the Grand Ronde Constitution and Business Council were created. But in 1940s, the Congress needed to reduce government spending, and they settled on a plan to liquidate all Indian reservations, to close the Indian office, and to terminate all federal recognition of the tribes. The government's intent was to eliminate forever any additional expenses from the tribes. Where do you hear power being used? Power over and power with and power among in this story? And in 1954, tribes capable of self-management, such as the Grand Ronde, they lost their recognition and rights as sovereign nations. 109 tribes or bands, meaning the people who were members of those tribes or bands, lost any reservation land they had and all legal status as Indian people. 62 of the terminated tribes were native to Oregon. Talk about erasure. But in 1983, restoration of tribal recognition happened. And in 1988, the Grand Ronde Reservation Act restored 9,811 acres of the original reservation. Resilience, determination. And this is a photo of the hearing for the restoration of the Grand Ronde Reservation. So I invite us today to pause for a moment. We say our land acknowledgement, but today, when we say this land acknowledgement, it now has more meaning because we are beginning to recognize the stories of our siblings, our ancestors, in the story of the land of this Willamette Valley in which we live today. And so I invite you to keep yourselves muted, but to say with me our recognition of the land. We gather together on holy living land, earth which supports and sustains us. We acknowledge that this region is the ancestral and unceded territory of the original peoples of the Multnomah, Wasco, Clackamas, Calumet, Cowlitz, Willamette Tumwater, and Cascades bands of the Chinookan peoples, the Tualatin band of Caulipuyan, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia and Willamette River. They lived and thrived in profound, complex, and interdependent relationship with the land and other beings long before white colonial settlement. We recognize we are here because of systemic policies of genocide, relocation, and assimilation that was forced upon them. Today, we acknowledge the region's diverse, vibrant Native communities who are still connected to this land. Indigenous peoples, 70,000 strong, with more than 280 tribes with at least 18 unique languages, both local and distant. We extend our deepest gratitude to our siblings and elders, past and present, who have stewarded this land and who carry on tribal traditions for present and future generations. Let's take a moment of silence and reverence and gratitude. And so I ask you today, what have you learned about the people who lived here? Where do you see intersections to your personal or familial story or to our community's story? What are the parts of our story we still do not know and why? Who benefits from these parts of the story being buried or silenced? Well, we're going to invite you to reflect with one another. What's stirring in you? Where do you hear your story in the stories that was just shared?